this story is set in a time way, way before you, way, way before me, way, way before any of our grandparents or great-great-grandparents. This story was set in a time when all of the land was divided into small kingdoms, ruled by kings and queens. And the kingdom in this story was ruled by a king, a very, very kind king. But this king didn't have a wife. You see, he did have a daughter, but when his daughter was being born, his wife sadly died. Now the king ruled his kingdom with kindness. He had a kind heart and a loving heart. He loved the people of his kingdom, but more than anybody else, he loved his daughter, the princess. For within her eyes, he could see his wife. He held her very, very tightly. They did everything together. Each day, they would begin by waking and sharing a lovely breakfast. But on the day of this story, that didn't happen. You see, on the day of this story, the king went to his daughter's bedroom door like he did every day, and he knocked. But there was no reply. He knocked again, but still no reply. He swung the door open and charged in, and there, lying in her bed, was his daughter. But her usual red, rosy cheeks were pale, ashen white. Her usual golden hair had turned grey. He felt for her pulse, and she was still alive, but she was clearly very, very, very unwell. He called for the kingdom's best doctor, and the doctor came and he took a look at the princess. He shook his head. He said to the king, "I am sorry. I do not know what this illness is, but I do know that there is no cure. Come the autumn time, she will surely die." Now, the king couldn't believe this. It was the start of summer. The whole kingdom was in bloom. Something must be done. So he called for his best horsemen and he said, "Travel the kingdom far and wide. Find doctors, witches, wizards, nurses, shamans, whoever you can. Anybody who can work with medicine, and bring them here. For my daughter must be saved. Whoever can save my daughters will get 1,000 gold pieces." So the horseman went. He rode far and wide, spreading the word, and the next day people started to arrive. Doctors, nurses, witches, wizards. One by one they filed in, but on that day, everybody left shaking their head. This went on for days and days and days. The months dropped by and autumn was getting ever closer. And as they got closer to autumn, fewer people came. The king began to give up hope. Maybe she wouldn't survive. Maybe come the autumn, death would take her. And he waited. And one night he was in his big counting room, and he was counting his gold, and he was thinking, I would give all of my gold just to have my daughter saved. And as he was thinking that, he heard a knock on the castle doors, and he went to open it himself, and he pulled the big doors open, and he looked. There didn't appear to be anybody there. "Hello!" he shouted. Still nobody. And then he felt a tugging on his leg, and he looked down, and there on the floor, no higher than his knee, was a little man. A goblin, some might say. He had a long, crooked nose. He had grey, scraggly hair that came down his back. He wore a leather waistcoat and big boots with a big belt and a buckle around his waist. The king said, Can I help you? And the goblin said, Yes, I have come to rescue your daughter. And the king looked at him. Surely not, he thought. How could this little goblin rescue my daughter? There is no way. So the king asked him, Well, how will you rescue my daughter? And the goblin said, I have a skill that nobody else has. I can use it to rescue your daughter. And the king said, Then tell me, what is your skill? What is your power? And the goblin said, I can see death. When death comes for your daughter, I will capture him and take him away, and he will be gone forever. Now the king was a little bit suspicious about this. Could see death? Nobody have ever heard of anything. But what options did he have? Nobody else was coming. All the doctors and nurses and witches and wizards had been. Reluctantly, he invited the goblin in. And they sat and they drank tea. And the goblin said to the king, I can rescue your daughter, but I don't want your gold pieces. If I rescue your daughter, you must promise to give me her hand in marriage. The king wasn't expecting that. Could he really let his daughter marry this ugly little goblin? Surely not. But again, he had no other option. Reluctantly, he agreed. He said, If you can save my daughter, you can have her hand in marriage. And the goblin said, On the next full moon, I will be back, and I will rescue your daughter. And with that, he disappeared. And the days ticked by and nobody else come. But on the next full moon, rat-a-tat-tat on the door came again, and the goblin came in, this time carrying a huge bag. He said to the king, Show me to your daughter's room. So the king showed him up to his daughter's room, and the king said, How are you going to capture death? The goblin said, When death enters the room, if he walks on the right side, he will not take her. She is not ready. But if he walks on the left side, he is going to take her. And on the left side, I will be hiding behind the curtains. And when he leans down to get her, I will get him in my bag, and I will take him off into the deepest forest where he will never be found. So the king agreed, and he showed the goblin up into the bedroom, and there the goblin waited behind the curtains. And the evening started to draw in, and the moon came up in the sky, and the stars were bright, and hid behind the curtains the goblin waited. And then when the clock struck midnight, there was a sudden cool breeze. The windows started to rattle, and on the stairs the goblin heard the creaking of footsteps. The footsteps came along the landing until they were outside the door, and then the door flung open, and there, stood in all of his glory, was death. The goblin took in a breath and waited, and death came to the edge of the bed. He looked at the king's daughter, and he took a step to the left. He walked down the side of the bed, and as he leaned over the daughter with his long, spindly arms, the goblin leapt out from behind the curtain and put death in the bag. There was an almighty struggle as death tried to get away, but Goblin got a rope and tied the bag. Death was captured. The goblin dragged death downstairs. He said to the king, I've caught him, give me your strongest horse. And they brought the strongest horse, and the goblin rode out through the kingdom, over the hills, through the mountains, up the river, until he came to a big pine forest. And there he climbed to the top of the tallest tree, and he tied the bag. And he returned back to the kingdom. And when he returned, all was well. The king's daughter was recovering. Her red cheeks had come back. Her golden blonde hair was back. By this time, the king had already told his daughter about the marriage. And even though she wasn't very happy about it, she was also filled with gratitude to the goblin for saving her life. So a few weeks later, a huge wedding was arranged. Everybody came, and the king's daughter was married to the goblin. The goblin was happy most of the time, but not all of the time. You see, in the back of his mind, he was always worried about death. Worried about death so much that he couldn't fully live his life. And as the days went on and the weeks went on and the months went on, something began to happen in the kingdom. Something that nobody had anticipated. You see, all the sick people who death would normally take, they couldn't be taken. Disease and illness started to spread. With more and more and more people, there wasn't enough food. Starvation began to kick in. And with illness and starvation and extra waste, the kingdom became a terrible place to live. The people went to the king and demanded he do something about it. But the king knew that the only thing that could be done about it was to return death. So he called for the goblin. He said, "Goblin, you must bring death back." And the goblin said, No, I cannot bring death back. He will surely destroy me as soon as I release him. The king said, "You must." And the goblin said, No. And the king said, "This is not a question. This is an order. Release death now." So reluctantly, the goblin got on the horse, and again he rode out of the kingdom and over the hills and through the mountains and up the river until he came to the forest. There at the top of the tallest tree was the bag with death. He climbed up and he pulled the bag down, and slowly he undid the knot. And as the bag fell open, death sprung out, and the goblin cowered below. "Please make it quick, make it painless," he said. And Death raised his hand, and he brought it down with great force. But just before he touched the goblin's head, he stopped. And he wagged his finger. "No," said Death, "I will not take you. I will go and do my work and bring balance back to the world. But I will not take you. Ever. You will live forever, lonely, ill, old, and I will never come for you, as a reminder to people that they should never avoid a full life in fear of death." And with that, Death went off, and he brought balance back to the world. Illness subsided, food grew, some people died, many more people were born. The kingdom regained its balance. But the goblin, what happened to him? Well, I guess we know. The goblin is still roaming the kingdom, asking for Death's help. But it's always a reminder to all of us that life is wonderful, but death is an important part of life. And without death, we cannot have birth. So the important lesson from this story is that death is a part of life. But we shouldn't let ourselves worry about death to the point where it stops us living a full life. I hope you've enjoyed that story. Thanks for stopping by. See you again at Weeby Kids. Bye.